The carriage wheels rattled over the cobblestones as Lady Elara Vance gazed out at the dreary London fog. Rain tapped against the windows, matching the nervous rhythm of her heart. "We are nearly there, my lady," her maid Bess whispered, intensifying Elara's dread. The knot in Elara's stomach tightened as the carriage turned onto a grand avenue lined with stately townhouses. It pulled through imposing iron gates, a long, winding drive stretching before them. Blackwood Crest emerged from the mist, a massive stone structure with Gothic turrets and chimneys stretching toward the gray skies like grasping fingers. It was magnificent and terrifying all at once, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Elara's throat tightened. This formidable place would be her prison. The carriage lurched to a stop on the graveled forecourt. A footman appeared, opening the door and extending an umbrella. Elara descended, her legs stiff from the long journey. A butler awaited at the entrance, his posture as rigid as the marble columns flanking the door. "Lady Elara Vance," he intoned with a formal bow. "Welcome to Blackwood Crest. I am Mr. Finch, the butler. Your maid will be shown to the servants' quarters." Elara was escorted through a labyrinth of hallways, adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and priceless artifacts from across the empire, evidence of the Blackwood family's extensive wealth and influence. The grandeur of the house made her family's once proud manor seem like a cottage in comparison. Every footstep echoed on the marble floors, announcing her presence in this domain where she was still a stranger. "The Marquis prefers to speak with you privately, Lady Elara," Mr. Finch informed her as they approached a heavy oak door at the end of a long corridor. Elara's stomach clenched, but she nodded. The butler opened the door with a practiced flourish, revealing an inner darkness. "The Marquis will see you now." Taking a deep breath, Elara stepped into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The study was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, behind which stood a tall figure silhouetted against a rain-streaked window. He turned slowly at her entrance, and Elara caught her breath. Lord Alaric Blackwood was not what she had expected. Though his face was set in severe lines, he was undeniably handsome, perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, his attire immaculate. There was a coldness to his bearing that made Elara shiver, despite the fire burning in the grate. "Lady Elara Vance," he said, his voice deep and devoid of warmth. It was a statement, not a question. She curtsied gracefully as she had been taught. He gestured to a chair positioned before his desk. "Please sit." Elara perched on the edge of the offered seat, her back straight as a board, hands folded demurely in her lap. The Marquis remained standing, studying her with clinical detachment, as though she were a horse at auction. His gaze traveled from her face to her modest traveling attire, and back again, assessing her value. "I've reviewed the contract your solicitor sent," he finally said, moving to a side table. "Everything appears to be in order. Your bloodline is impeccable, despite your father's indiscretions." He walked to a sideboard and poured himself a glass of amber liquid without offering her refreshment. "I assume you understand the terms of our arrangement." "I do," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Your financial support in exchange for the Vance name joining with the Blackwoods." "Precisely." He took a measured sip from his glass. "I require an heir, and society expects a man in my position to have a wife. Your mother will be provided for, and your family name preserved." He set his glass down with a sharp click. "But let us be perfectly clear about what this is and what it is not." He approached her, his expression unreadable, standing uncomfortably close. "While this union will be legal in every sense, you should harbor no romantic illusions. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." The words cut through her like ice. Elara met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated despite her racing heart. "I understand perfectly, my lord. And I hope you understand that I am not entering this arrangement with any delusions of affection. I do this for my family just as you do this for yours. I require no false sentiment, only the respect due to the future bearer of your name and the mother of your heirs." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprised at her boldness, before his expression hardened once more. "The wedding will take place in 3 days' time." "Good day, Lady Elara." He turned his back to her, a clear dismissal. As the door closed behind her, Elara fought to maintain her composure. A severe-looking woman awaited in the corridor, Mrs. Croft, presumably, who led her through another maze of corridors to the east wing without a single word of welcome. The rooms assigned to her were spacious and luxuriously appointed with silk damask wallpaper and heavy velvet draperies. Yet they felt as cold and impersonal as her future husband. "Dinner is served at 7 precisely," Mrs. Croft informed her, her tone suggesting tardiness would be an unforgivable sin. "Your maid will be up shortly with your belongings." When the housekeeper had gone, Elara sank onto a brocade settee, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. Bess arrived soon after, fussing over Elara's appearance and unpacking her modest trousseau into the massive wardrobes. "The servants are all aflutter about you, my lady," she reported. "It seems the Marquis hasn't entertained a lady at Blackwood Crest since his father died years ago." "I am hardly being entertained, Bess. I am a business acquisition, nothing more." Bess clucked her tongue. Now, things may not be as bleak as they appear. Perhaps in time—" "No, Bess," Elara interrupted gently. "The Marquis has made his position quite clear. This marriage is a transaction, not a romance." That evening, dinner was a silent affair, broken only by the clink of silver against fine china and the occasional murmured instruction to the footman. The Marquis spoke little, and Elara, exhausted from the journey and their earlier encounter, had no energy for meaningless pleasantries. When they parted in the grand hallway, he merely inclined his head. "Until tomorrow, Lady Elara." That night, alone in her new bedchamber with its elaborate furnishings and oppressive silence, Elara stood at the window, watching moonlight break through the clouds to illuminate the formal gardens below. "I may never be his true wife," she whispered to herself, "but I will not be broken by this place or by him. I am Elara Vance, and I still have my pride." She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. "This may be a prison of circumstance, but I will find a way to make it bearable. I must." The next morning, Bess delivered Elara's tea, her usually cheerful face troubled. "My lady, a gentleman called at Vancehaven yesterday, asking rather pointed questions about your new status." Elara's heart gave a disagreeable lurch. "A gentleman? Who?" "He called himself Sir Reginald Craven, my lady, insisted he was merely ensuring all was in order with your late father's estate, but Cook said he had a most unpleasant glint in his eye." Elara dismissed it with a wave, but a cold pang of dread settled in her stomach. Sir Reginald Craven. She had hoped to leave him and her father's gambling debts behind. 3 days later, Elara stood in St. George's Church in Hanover Square, wearing a wedding gown of ivory silk and Belgian lace, a gown chosen and paid for by her soon-to-be husband. Her mother was too ill to attend, but had sent a small pearl brooch, the last of her jewelry that hadn't been sold to pay creditors, which Elara wore pinned over her heart. Bess, her eyes brimming, offered quiet comfort in the vestry. The church was filled with London's elite, though Elara recognized few faces. They had come not out of affection for either bride or groom, but out of curiosity, eager to witness the union between the notorious Marquis and the daughter of the disgraced Earl. Elara stood perfectly still as the Archbishop performed the ceremony, her face a composed mask that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. The Marquis stood beside her, equally impassive, reciting his vows with the detached precision of a man conducting a routine business transaction. When Alaric slid the gold band onto her finger, his touch was impersonal, his expression unchanged. As they rode back to Blackwood Crest in silence, now husband and wife, Elara caught the Marquis studying her reflection in the carriage window. "You played your part well," he said, the first words he'd spoken to her directly since the ceremony. "The ton will have nothing to gossip about regarding the ceremony." "I am gratified to have met with your approval, my lord," she replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but perhaps the closest thing to it she had seen. "You have spirit, Lady Elara. That may serve you well in society, so long as it is properly contained. The wedding breakfast was an elaborate affair with countless dishes and fine wines. Yet, Elara could barely eat. Her stomach knotted with tension. She performed her duties as the new Marquesa, smiling at the right moments, conversing pleasantly with guests who had come more out of curiosity than genuine goodwill. As she circulated among the crowd, she caught fragments of whispered conversations. Poor girl, cold as ice. That one married for the money, no doubt. Each barbed comment strengthened her resolve to maintain her dignity. She would not give these vultures the satisfaction of seeing her distress. By evening, when the last guests had departed, Elara was exhausted, her face aching from the effort of maintaining her pleasant expression. She retreated to her chambers as instructed, relieved when there was no summons from her husband. Their arrangement, it seemed, extended to all aspects of marriage. As Bess helped her out of the elaborate wedding gown, Elara caught sight of herself in the mirror. The Marquesa of Blackwood Crest. A title without substance. A wife in name only. Perhaps it is better this way, she said quietly, as Bess unpinned her hair. At least I know precisely where I stand. But as she lay awake in her bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of Blackwood Crest, Elara couldn't help but wonder about the man sleeping in another wing of the house. What had made him so cold? Why did he need this marriage if he wanted no true wife? The Marquis's words echoed in her mind. You will never be my true wife. Elara pulled the covers tighter around herself as a chill wind rattled the windows. We shall see, my lord, she whispered into the darkness. We shall see. Weeks later, one morning, Mr. Finch, usually a bastion of stoic composure, approached Elara with unusual hesitation. My lady, he began, his voice slightly softer than usual. Sir Reginald Craven has called. He insists on a personal audience with you regarding your late father's affairs. Elara's hand, reaching for her morning tea, paused. The name sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. I have nothing to discuss with Sir Reginald, she stated, her voice firm, though her heart pounded. Please inform him that all matters pertaining to my family are now handled by the Marquis solicitor. Mr. Finch bowed, but Elara felt the tightening grip of her past, a shadow she could not easily outrun. The weeks following the wedding unfolded in a pattern of careful routine at Blackwood Crest. Elara rose each morning to breakfast alone in her sitting room, spent her days familiarizing herself with the massive estate, and dined with her husband only when social obligations demanded it. The Marquis remained as distant as the moon, disappearing to London on business for days at a time without explanation, and secluding himself in his study when present. Elara's life as Marquesa of Blackwood Crest bore little resemblance to the marriage she had once imagined for herself. There were no shared confidences, no gentle touches, no companionship. Instead, she found herself mistress of a grand house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, populated by servants who watched her with curious, sometimes pitying eyes. Yet Elara refused to surrender to self-pity. If she could not have a true marriage, she would at least make herself useful. She began by learning the names of every servant, from the highest-ranking butler to the lowest scullery maid. She studied the household accounts, memorized the family histories of the tenant farmers, and explored every corner of the sprawling estate. Knowledge, she decided, was her best defense against feeling like an interloper, a way to reclaim some semblance of control in a life that had been entirely dictated by others. Elara found a quiet solace in the conservatory, arranging a vase of late-season blooms. Her gloved fingers moved with a practiced grace, heedless of the faint dust on the leaves. My lady, Mrs. Croft's voice, as rigid as the starched lace on her cap, broke the quiet. These tasks are hardly befitting your station. We have gardeners for cutting flowers. Elara paused, selecting a deep crimson rose to complement the arrangement. I find it soothing, Mrs. Croft. Besides, I have always believed that idleness breeds discontent. The housekeeper's lips thinned with disapproval. The previous Marquess had never concerned herself with such matters, Mrs. Croft stated, her disapproval clear. The previous Marquesa? Elara asked. Scissors still. You mean Lord Alaric's mother? Indeed, Lady Isolde Blackwood, Mrs. Croft replied, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. A most refined lady. Gentle, kind, even, perhaps too kind for her own good. A flicker of old grief crossed her severe face, quickly masked. She understood the proper distance between the family and the staff. But it is not my place to speak of family matters, my lady. Before Ilara could press further, a footman appeared at the conservatory entrance. Begging your pardon, my lady, but the Marquis has returned from London and requests your presence in the drawing-room. Surprised by the unusual summons, in the 6 weeks of their marriage, they had never taken tea together, let alone engaged in private conversation beyond the most perfunctory exchanges. Ilara hastily removed her gardening apron and smoothed her hair. "Thank you, James. Please tell his lordship I shall be there directly." She found Alaric by the window, still in his traveling clothes, looking unusually weary. Dark shadows underscored his eyes. "You wish to see me, my lord." Ilara curtsied slightly. Alaric gestured to a small rosewood table where a tea service had been laid. "Please sit. I have some matters to discuss." Her curiosity piqued by this unprecedented invitation, Ilara obeyed. Alaric remained standing, pacing restlessly before the fireplace. "I have been informed that my cousin, Lady Seraphina Sterling, and her daughter, Miss Isolde Sterling, intend to visit next week. They will stay for a fortnight." Ilara nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I shall ensure the guest rooms are prepared appropriately." "There is more," he said, an edge in his tone. "Lady Seraphina was close to my father. She may attempt to assert her influence. She is accustomed to having her way at Blackwood Crest." "And how would you prefer I handle such attempts?" Ilara asked carefully. For the first time, a flicker of something almost like approval crossed his features. "With the same spirit you have shown thus far, Lady Ilara. My cousin respects strength, if little else." As a footman announced that the Marquis's bath had been prepared, Ilara found herself speaking without forethought. "My lord, I know very little of your family. If I am to navigate this visit successfully, perhaps you might enlighten me further." Alaric paused at the door, his back to her. For a moment, Ilara thought he would ignore her request. Then, without turning, he said, "My mother died when I was 12. A fever. Lady Seraphina arrived before the funeral and has been inserting herself into Blackwood affairs ever since." His voice hardened. "She has a daughter, Miss Isolde, who is near your age. They are our closest living relatives, but do not mistake that for affection." With those cryptic words he departed, leaving Ilara with more questions than answers. That evening at dinner, another rare occasion they dined together, Ilara ventured to probe further. "Tell me about your mother, my lord. Mrs. Croft mentioned she was much beloved by the staff." Alaric's knife stilled against his plate. "Did she?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "She seemed reluctant to elaborate," Ilara admitted, "but I should like to know more about the lady whose place I now occupy." Her husband resumed cutting his meat with precise movements. "My mother was unlike anyone else in our circle," he finally said. "She came from a respectable family, but not one of great wealth or title. My father married her despite considerable opposition from his family. For love, so I was led to believe. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her spirit that captivated everyone who knew her. She insisted on personally supervising my education. The gardens were her particular passion. The rose garden beyond the east terrace was her creation." "The one with the marble fountain?" Ilara asked gently, recalling the neglected garden she had discovered during her explorations. "Once magnificent, but now overgrown and wild." He nodded, something distant in his eyes. "She spent hours there, especially in summer." "Why has it been allowed to fall into disrepair?" Ilara asked. Alaric's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "After her death, my father ordered it abandoned. He had the gardeners focus their efforts elsewhere." His tone made it clear that the subject was closed. They finished the meal in silence, but as they rose from the table, Alaric surprised her once more. "If you wish to restore the garden," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I would have no objection." Before Ilara could respond, he bowed stiffly and left the room. The next morning, Ilara sought out the head gardener, Mr. Willow, a weathered man with soil-stained hands and kind eyes. When she inquired about Lady Isolde's rose garden, his face lit up with unexpected enthusiasm. "Oh, my lady, it was the jewel of Blackwood," he said, removing his cap. "Such roses you've never seen? Varieties from all over the world. The old Marquis had them imported specially for her ladyship. Why was it abandoned? Elara asked, walking beside him toward the neglected garden. Mr. Willow's expression clouded. Not my place to say, my lady, but it broke my heart to watch it go to ruin. The young master, the Marquis, that is, he used to help his mother tend the roses when he was a lad, had a knack for it. He did. Elara tried to imagine her stern, reserved husband as a boy, helping his mother among the roses. The image seemed impossibly at odds with the man she knew. Could it be restored, do you think? She asked, as they reached the garden's wrought iron gate. Aye, with time and care. Mr. Willow ran a loving hand over the rusted gate. The bones are still good. Roses are hardy things. They survive more than you'd expect. Then, let us begin, Elara decided. I'll want detailed plans by the end of the week, Mr. Willow. We'll start with clearing the overgrowth and assessing which plants can be saved. The old gardener's face broke into a broad smile. Over the next several days, Elara threw herself into the garden restoration project, heedless of the dirt that stained her gowns. Alaric made no comment on her activities, though Elara occasionally glimpsed him watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. It was during a rare respite in her sitting room, late afternoon, that a new shadow fell. Elara found a discreetly placed letter on her desk, sealed with a familiar, ugly crest, that of Sir Reginald Craven. Her blood ran cold. The letter, formal yet menacing, demanded a private meeting to discuss her unsettled affairs and her late father's outstanding obligations. It subtly hinted at unpleasant consequences should she refuse, implying public exposure. Elara crumpled the parchment, a knot forming in her stomach. Her past, it seemed, was not content to remain in Vance Haven, threatening to unravel the fragile peace she had found. It was during her third day of garden work that Elara discovered the small stone bench, hidden beneath an overgrown arbor. As the gardeners cleared away the strangling vines, a name was revealed carved into the seat. Isolde. A powerful connection, poignant and unexpected, settled over Elara. This was not merely a bench, it was a personal relic, a silent testament to the woman who had created this once magnificent place, a woman whose name now resonated with a quiet reverence in the heart of Blackwood Crest. The Marquis had it made for her 15th birthday, a voice said behind her. Elara turned to find Mrs. Croft standing at the garden's edge, her usual stern expression softened by memory. They were very close, then? Elara asked. The housekeeper nodded. As close as mother and son could be. She was his shield against... She stopped abruptly, seeming to remember herself. Against the usual hardships of childhood, my lady. Elara sensed there was more to the story, much more. But she had learned that direct questions rarely yielded answers in this house of secrets. Instead, she brushed her soil-covered hands on her apron and said casually, I should like to make this bench the centerpiece of the restored garden, Mrs. Croft. Perhaps surrounded by white roses. They symbolize remembrance, I believe. Something like approval flickered in the housekeeper's eyes. Her ladyship was partial to white roses, as it happens. She called them her moonlight blossoms. For the first time since Elara's arrival, Mrs. Croft offered what might almost be called a smile. The master was born on a full moon night, she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Lady Isolde always said it was why he was so stubborn, touched by moon magic, she called it. The confidence, small as it was, felt like a victory. That evening, unable to sleep, Elara ventured to the library in search of a book. The vast room, lined with thousands of volumes, was usually deserted at this hour, but as she pushed open the heavy door, she was startled to find her husband already there. Alaric stood by a window, a small object cradled in his hands, his face illuminated only by moonlight. He had not heard her enter, and for a moment Elara observed him unguarded. Gone was the cold, impassive mask he wore like armor. In its place was an expression of such raw grief that Elara nearly gasped aloud. He was staring down at what appeared to be a miniature portrait, his fingers tracing its edges with a tenderness she had never witnessed from him. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot, and Alaric's head snapped up, his eyes widened at the sight of her, and he hastily slipped the portrait into his waistcoat pocket. "Forgive me," Elara said quickly. "I did not mean to intrude. It is of no consequence." His voice had resumed its usual detached tone, though Elara noticed his hands were not entirely steady. "You could not have known I would be here." Elara moved toward the indicated shelf. As she reached for a volume, her dressing gown slipped slightly, revealing a fading bruise on her forearm, a souvenir from her enthusiastic gardening efforts. "You're injured," Alaric said sharply. He crossed to her side with unexpected swiftness, taking her arm with gentle fingers and pushing back the sleeve to examine the bruise. His touch, the first voluntary contact between them since their wedding day, sent an inexplicable warmth through her. "Roses have thorns for a reason," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "They are not meant to be tamed easily." There was something in his gaze and intensity that had nothing to do with the minor injury that made Elara's breath catch. "The most beautiful things often require the most care," she replied, her voice hardly above a whisper. For a moment they stood frozen in that tableau, his fingers on her skin. Then, as if suddenly remembering himself, Alaric released her arm and stepped back. "Good night, Lady Elara." He strode from the room without a backward glance. The next morning, Elara found a small package outside her door, a jar of salve wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no note, but the gesture spoke volumes. That same afternoon, as Elara supervised the clearing of a choked pathway in the rose garden, a familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "So this is where you've been hiding yourself," Alaric said, surveying the transformation taking place. Where once had been wilderness, neat piles of cleared debris now stood alongside freshly turned earth and salvaged plants. Elara straightened, pushing a stray lock of hair from her perspiring forehead. "Hardly hiding, my lord. We've been making quite a racket, I'm afraid." "Indeed." His eyes moved over the garden, taking in the progress. "Mr. Willow informs me you've been working alongside the gardeners. Is that wise? Wiser than wasting my days on idle gossip and needlepoint, I should think," Elara replied with more spirit than she had intended. "Besides, I find the work satisfying, to see order emerging from chaos. There is a certain pleasure in that." The Marquis studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You continue to surprise me, Lady Elara." "Is that good or ill, my lord?" "I have yet to decide." He glanced toward the stone bench, now freed from its prison of vines and partially cleaned. "You found my mother's seat," Elara nodded. "Mrs. Croft told me you had it made for her." "For her 35th birthday," he corrected. "Not her 15th, as I suspect Mrs. Croft said. Our housekeeper's memory sometimes plays tricks on her these days." "It's a beautiful piece," Elara said. "I thought to make it the centerpiece of the garden, surrounded by white roses. Mrs. Croft mentioned they were your mother's favorite." The Marquis was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the carved name. "White roses were indeed her favorite," he finally said, "but she preferred them mingled with red ones. She said it made the white seem purer by contrast. This personal recollection, freely offered, felt like a gift." "Then we shall plant them as she preferred," Elara said softly. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, his gaze sharp upon her face. Elara considered her answer carefully. "Because something beautiful should not be left to ruin," she said at last. "Because your mother created this place with love, and such things deserve to be honored." She paused, then added quietly, "And because I have little else to occupy my days in a house where I am more ornament than wife." The last words slipped out unbidden, but instead of the cold rebuke she expected, the Marquis merely looked thoughtful. "My mother would have liked you, I think," he said, the words seeming to surprise even himself. Before Elara could respond, he turned and walked away, his tall figure soon disappearing around the hedge. But the brief exchange had left her with a curious sense of hope, as if perhaps the first tiny crack had appeared in the wall between them. That evening, as Bess prepared her for bed, a distraught Bess appeared at the door to Elara's sitting room, clutching a letter sealed with the ugly crest of Sir Reginald Craven. "My lady," Bess whispered, her hands trembling. "This arrived. From Sir Reginald himself." Elara broke the seal. The letter, penned in a florid but menacing hand, threatened to expose the true state of the Vance accounts and her late father's scandals to the ton, if a considerable sum was not paid by the week's end. Her blood ran cold. The danger to her reputation, to Alaric's position, to the fragile stability of Blackwood Crest was now explicit and imminent. Later that night, a knock sounded at the door to Alara's sitting room. Bess went to answer it, returning moments later with a peculiar expression. "It's the Marquis, my lady," she whispered, eyes wide with surprise. "He asks if you would join him in the library when convenient." Alara's heart quickened. Curiosity warred with apprehension. "Did he say why?" "No, my lady, only that he has something to show you." Hastily donning a suitable evening dress, a simple blue silk that could be fastened without assistance, Elara made her way to the library, curious and slightly apprehensive. The blackmail letter, still clutched in her hand, felt like a burning coal, the decision of whether to reveal it weighing heavily on her. She found Alaric standing before the fireplace, a leather-bound book in his hands. "Thank you for coming," he said, his usual formality softened by something that might almost be nervousness. "I thought you might find this of interest for your garden restoration project." He extended the book toward her. Elara took it carefully, opening the cover to reveal pages of delicate botanical illustrations, roses of every variety, painted in exquisite detail with notes in a flowing feminine hand. "My mother's garden journal," the Marquis explained. "She documented every plant, its placement and care instructions. I thought it might be useful." Elara looked up from the precious volume, deeply moved by the gesture. "This is extraordinarily helpful, my lord. But are you certain you wish to entrust it to me? It must be very dear to you." "It is," he acknowledged, "but it was meant for a gardener's hands, not to gather dust in a drawer. My mother would have wanted it used. She taught herself botanical illustration." "She was talented," Elara said sincerely. "She was." The Marquis agreed, and for the first time Elara heard genuine warmth in his voice. "My father thought it a frivolous pursuit," he added, "but she persisted." Elara looked up sharply. "Your father disapproved of her interests?" Something dark flickered in the Marquis's eyes. "My father disapproved of many things that brought others joy, particularly things that brought her joy." The bitterness in his tone revealed volumes about the previous Marquis, and Elara began to understand something of the shadows that haunted her husband. Sensing that she had stumbled upon tender ground, she changed the subject. "Will you tell me about some of these varieties?" she asked, gesturing to the journal. "I confess I know little of roses beyond their beauty." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. To her surprise, the Marquise settled into a chair beside hers and began turning pages, pointing out particular specimens and recounting their origins. For over an hour they sat thus, heads bent together over the journal, their conversation flowing more naturally than ever before. It was only when the clock chimed 11 that the Marquis seemed to remember himself. "I've kept you too long," he said, rising abruptly. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," Elara assured him, reluctant to break the spell of companionship that had briefly existed between them. "I've enjoyed our conversation immensely." "As have I," he admitted, as if the realization surprised him. Perhaps we might continue it another evening." "I would like that very much," Elara said softly. For a moment longer he stood looking at her, something unspoken in his gaze. Then he bowed formally and bid her good night. As Elara returned to her chambers, the precious garden journal clutched to her chest. She felt a cautious optimism stirring within her. The wall between them had not fallen, but tonight had revealed that it might not be as impenetrable as she had feared. The grand entrance hall of Blackwood Crest, usually a place of hushed dignity, was swept into a flurry of silk and demands with the arrival of Lady Seraphina Sterling and her daughter, Miss Isolde Sterling. Lady Seraphina, a striking woman in her mid-40s with shrewd, assessing eyes, immediately began inspecting the house with the air of one checking that her possessions had been properly maintained in her absence. Her gaze, sharp and critical, lingered on a slightly faded tapestry, then on a statue of a Roman emperor that seemed to displease her. Beside her, Miss Isolde Sterling, a pretty young woman of perhaps 20, with her mother's dark coloring but none of her sharp edges, cast nervous glances at Lord Alaric and Elara, who stood waiting to greet them. Her discomfort was palpable, a silent contrast to her mother's imperious presence. That evening, at dinner, Lady Seraphina wasted no time in establishing her dominance. "The drawing-room draperies are showing wear, Alaric," she announced, her voice a polished blade as she surveyed the opulent dining room. "You really must have new ones commissioned. I saw the most divine fabric at Whitley's in London. I'd be happy to order it for you." Alaric's expression remained neutral, a mask Elara had come to recognize. "I believe such matters now fall under my wife's purview, Seraphina," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Lady Seraphina's gaze swung to Elara, assessing her with thinly veiled disdain. "Of course. How forgetful of me," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Though perhaps Elara would appreciate my guidance, being so new to her role. "It can be quite overwhelming to manage a house of this stature, especially for someone not raised in our circles." The barb was thinly veiled, and Elara felt her cheeks warm, a familiar rush of indignation stirring within her. Before Elara could respond to Lady Seraphina's insinuation, Alaric spoke again. "My wife has been managing admirably," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "Blackwood has never been in better hands." The unexpected defense left Elara momentarily speechless, a surge of surprise and appreciation washing over her. Lady Seraphina's smile tightened, a barely perceptible flicker of annoyance in her shrewd eyes, but she merely inclined her head in acknowledgement. She turned her attention to her daughter, Miss Isolde, who had been silently pushing food around her plate, occasionally casting nervous glances at the table's occupants. The tension, though momentarily diffused by Alaric's intervention, hung heavy in the air, a silent declaration of war from his formidable cousin. After the meal, when the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, Lady Seraphina wasted no time in resuming her assault. "You must find Blackwood quite provincial after London," she remarked, settling onto a sofa as though it were a throne. "Of course you haven't been presented at court yet, have you? Such a pity your marriage was so hastily arranged." She sighed dramatically, then continued, "Poor Isolde, she never quite fit in, you know. From what I've heard, she was much beloved." Elara said carefully, noting how Miss Isolde tensed at the mention of the former Marquesa, her eyes flicking up briefly. "Oh, by the servants, certainly," Lady Seraphina conceded with a dismissive wave. "She had a way with them. But in society, I'm afraid she was rather out of her depth. My cousin, the late Marquis, made a terrible mistake in marrying so far beneath him." Her eyes glittered as she examined Elara. A mistake Alaric seems determined to repeat. The insult hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. Elara felt her pulse quicken with anger, but years of training and proper behavior kept her expression composed. "How fortunate, then, that the choice was his to make," she replied, with deceptive mildness, her voice steady. "Just as the management of this household is now mine." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "Speaking of which, I must speak with Mrs. Croft about tomorrow's menus." She departed before Lady Seraphina could respond, her heart pounding. As Elara reached the door, she glanced back. Miss Isolde, who had remained silent throughout her mother's tirade, met her gaze briefly. There was a flicker in the younger woman's eyes, a fleeting expression of shared understanding, perhaps even a subtle warning, before she quickly looked away. Only when she was safely in the corridor did Elara allow herself a small, grim smile. The battle lines had been drawn. Later that night, as Bess prepared her for bed, Elara's thoughts remained troubled. She despised his mother. She mused aloud, watching her reflection in the dressing-table mirror. "I wonder why?" Bess, ever discreet, hesitated before responding. "There are whispers below stairs, my lady," she said softly, brushing out Elara's hair with gentle strokes. "The servants who have been here longest say that Lady Seraphina had hoped to marry the old Marquis herself, before he chose Lady Isolde instead." Elara's eyebrows rose. "And she's harbored that resentment all these years? Some wounds fester rather than heal," Bess said wisely, her eyes meeting Elara's in the mirror, especially those to pride. Elara thought of the garden journal, of the woman who had lovingly documented each rose. What had it been like for gentle Isolde Blackwood to live under the same roof as a woman who resented her very existence. "There's more," Bess added, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say that after Lady Isolde died, Lady Serafina was quick to console the old Marquis. Very quick indeed. Within months, she was acting as mistress of Blackwood in all but name." Elara recalled her husband's cold voice from their earlier conversation. Lady Serafina arrived before the funeral and has been inserting herself into Churchill affairs ever since. The pieces were beginning to fit together, painting a picture of a household divided by grief, resentment, and perhaps something darker. "And the Marquis, my husband?" Elara asked, her voice barely audible. "What was his relationship with Lady Serafina?" Bess's expression grew troubled, her gaze distant. "I cannot say for certain, my lady. But the older servants hint that the young master suffered greatly after his mother's death, and not just from grief." A chill ran through Elara as she considered the implications. What kind of childhood had her stern husband endured in this grand, cold house? What secrets lay buried beneath the polished floors of Blackwood Crest? As she lay awake that night, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of Blackwood Crest, Elara's thoughts turned to the man sleeping in another wing of the house. A man who had declared she would never be his true wife, yet who had defended her against Lady Serafina's barbs, who had shared his mother's precious garden journal. She resolved to continue her work in the garden, not just for the sake of honoring Isolde Blackwood's memory, but because somehow she sensed that in restoring what had been broken, she might find a way to reach the man whose heart had been similarly neglected. She believed the garden could heal him. The fortnight of Lady Serafina's visit stretched Elara's patience to its limits, but she emerged victorious in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new attempts by the older woman to undermine Elara's authority in the household, from questioning the luncheon menu to subtly criticizing Elara's choice of flowers for the drawing room. Yet, with each challenge, the Marquis sided firmly with his wife, his neutral expression hardening into an unyielding resolve whenever Serafina overstepped. By the time the visitors departed, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Blackwood Crest, a subtle rebalancing of power that left Elara feeling more secure in her position than ever before. Serafina's parting glare confirmed her defeat, a small but satisfying victory. More importantly, the shared adversary had forged an unexpected alliance between Elara and her husband. The Marquis began joining her for breakfast, a meal they had never before shared, making quiet observations about the news of the day or the estate's finances. Their conversations, once stilted and formal, now flowed more easily, particularly when discussing the garden restoration, which had become Elara's passion. It was a fragile connection, built on shared purpose rather than explicit affection, but it was a connection nonetheless. The silence between them was no longer oppressive, but merely comfortable, a quiet space where unspoken understandings could begin to grow. As summer faded into autumn, bringing cooler winds and shorter days, the garden began to take shape. The wild tangle had been cleared away, revealing the original pathways and beds that had lain hidden for years. Many of the old roses had proved remarkably resilient, sending up new shoots once freed from the choking weeds. With the guidance of Lady Isolde's journal, Elara and Mr. Willow had created a planting scheme that honored the original design, while adding complementary new varieties. The Marquis took to walking the grounds each evening, his path invariably leading him to the rose garden, where Elara often worked until dusk, her hands stained with soil, her cheeks flushed with exertion. He would observe her progress, sometimes offering memories of how the garden had looked in his mother's time, his voice a little less formal, a little more reflective. Occasionally he would even roll up his sleeves and assist with a particularly stubborn root, or help position a new trellis. During these shared moments, Elara caught glimpses of the man beneath the formal exterior, a man with unexpected gentleness in his hands, and memories of happiness not entirely extinguished by grief. His eyes, though still often shadowed, held a spark of something softer as he pointed out where a particular crimson climber had once reached. She began to understand that the cold, distant Marquis, who had declared she would never be his true wife, was a fortress built around a heart that had known too much pain, a heart slowly, tentatively, being coaxed back to life by the return of beauty and memory. The golden light of the late afternoon, filtering through the turning leaves, seemed to soften the harsh lines of his face as he worked beside her. It was during her third day of dedicated garden work, as the gardeners cleared away a particularly dense thicket of strangling vines near Isolde's bench, that Elara discovered it. Hidden beneath a cascade of withered ivy, a small, cleverly concealed compartment was revealed in the stone base of the bench. With a gasp, Elara knelt and carefully extracted its contents. A small leather-bound pouch, damp and decaying, containing a single water-damaged, sealed letter. The parchment felt fragile in her hands. It was addressed to a dearest friend from Isolde. Visible fragments hinted at troubles and a fear for Alaric's future, but the rest was illegible, blurred by years of dampness. Elara's heart pounded with a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was more than just a relic. It was a tangible clue, a voice from the past, deepening the mystery surrounding Lady Isolde's death and her son's painful childhood. She carefully put the letter aside, knowing its significance. On a crisp October evening, as the last rays of sunlight gilded the turning leaves, Elara was supervising the installation of a small fountain near her mother-in-law's bench when the Marquis appeared at the garden entrance. His face was unusually grave, and he carried a letter in his hand. "My lord," Elara greeted him, setting down her gardening gloves. "Is something amiss?" "I've had word from London," he said, his voice tight, lacking its usual measured calm. "There has been an outbreak of influenza in the city. Several prominent families have been affected." Elara's heart sank. Influenza was a dreaded visitor, a silent killer capable of sweeping through entire households with devastating consequences. She had seen healthy lives snuffed out in days. "Should we be concerned here at Blackwood?" she asked, a knot forming in her stomach. "Perhaps." He folded the letter carefully, his gaze distant. "I must travel to London tomorrow. My solicitor has fallen ill, and there are urgent matters that cannot wait." "Surely they can wait until the outbreak subsides," Elara protested, her concern for him overriding her usual deference. "It's not worth risking your health." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, at her unexpected display of worry. "The affairs of an estate this size do not pause for illness, Lady Elara. I will take precautions." Elara wanted to argue further, to insist, but knew it would be futile. Instead, she nodded, trying to mask her worry. "How long will you be gone?" "No more than 3 days," he assured her, though his voice held a trace of weariness. "I shall return before the week's end." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Elara to stare after him, a cold dread settling in her heart. That night, as Elara prepared for bed, she found herself unusually restless. The thought of the Marquis exposing himself to the dangers of an influenza outbreak troubled her more deeply than she cared to admit. When had her feelings toward him shifted from weary curiosity to genuine concern? She could not pinpoint the exact moment, but she knew with certainty that the prospect of harm coming to him now caused her genuine distress. "You're fond of him," Bess observed quietly as she brushed Elara's hair, her eyes meeting Elara's in the mirror. Elara met her maid's gaze steadily. "Is that so surprising?" "Not to me, my lady," Bess said with a small smile. "He's changed these past months. Anyone with eyes can see it." "Has he?" Elara murmured, more to herself than to Bess. "Or have I simply learned to see him more clearly?" "Perhaps both," Bess suggested wisely. The Marquis departed early the next morning, before Elara had risen. She found a brief note on her breakfast tray, written in his precise hand. "Lady Elara, I shall return by Friday. The garden journal remains in your capable hands." The 3 days stretched longer than any Elara had experienced at Blackwood. She filled them with activity, supervising the garden work, reviewing household accounts, and writing long overdue letters to old friends. Yet her thoughts continually drifted to London and the man who had gone there despite the danger. She found herself checking the grand clock in the hall more often, listening for the distant sound of carriage wheels, a low thrum of anxiety constant beneath her purposeful facade. During her diligent work in the rose garden, Ilara was approached by Miss Isolde Sterling. The young woman, usually quiet and hesitant in her mother's presence, seemed more at ease alone. She observed Ilara's mud-stained gloves and the progress of the restoration with a soft, almost wistful expression. "My Aunt Isolde always said the most beautiful things needed the strongest roots," Miss Isolde commented quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Especially in a household like this." Ilara paused, scissors in hand, meeting Miss Isolde's gaze. There was a hidden meaning in the remark, a subtle sympathy that connected the former Marquesa, Ilara herself, and the challenges of Blackwood Crest. Ilara sensed a quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the unseen battles fought within these walls. Miss Isolde offered a small, knowing smile before excusing herself, leaving Ilara to ponder the cryptic, yet comforting, insight. Later that afternoon, as Ilara sat in her sitting room poring over garden plans, Mr. Finch, usually unflappable, delivered another letter, his brow subtly furrowed. "From Sir Reginald Craven, my lady," he announced, his voice a shade more somber than usual. This letter was not anonymous. It was addressed directly to her, the seal bold and aggressive. The words inside were stark and chilling, threatening to send an agent to Blackwood Crest if his demands for a timely settlement of the Vance family debts were not met by the week's end. It explicitly mentioned exposing, quote, "the true state of the Vance accounts and her late father's scandals to the ton," implying public disgrace that would surely affect Alaric and the Blackwood name. Ilara's blood ran cold. She felt truly cornered now. The comfortable distance she had maintained from this threat was gone. She knew she must act soon, and the terrifying thought that she might have to confide in Alaric, to lay bare her family's shame, settled heavily in her chest. She paced the room, the crumpled letter clutched in her hand, her heart hammering with a desperate urgency. On Friday morning, Ilara woke with a sense of acute anticipation. She took extra care with her appearance, selecting a deep blue dress that Bess had once mentioned brought out the color in her eyes. She arranged her hair in a softer style, allowing a few tendrils to frame her face. All day, she found herself glancing towards the grand entrance, a nervous flutter in her stomach. When the Marquis had not arrived by dinner time, she told herself there had likely been delays on the road. Nothing to worry about, but the quiet certainty she projected was a fragile shield against the growing worry that gnawed at her. A worry amplified by the ominous letter from Sir Reginald. The hours crawled by, each tick of the clock deepening her unease. It was nearly midnight when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall, the clatter of carriage wheels on the gravel, the hurried footsteps of servants, and Mr. Finch's voice, usually a model of stoicism, raised in alarm. Propriety forgotten, a shawl thrown hastily over her nightgown, Ilara hurried downstairs. She found chaos in the main hall. The Marquis had indeed returned, but he was being supported between two footmen, his powerful frame alarmingly flushed, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. His dark hair clung to his fever-swept brow, and his eyes were glazed. "My lord!" Diana rushed forward, her heart seizing with a primal fear. As the footman helped him to a nearby chair, Ilara pressed her palm to Alaric's forehead and gasped at the intense heat radiating from his skin. "You're burning with fever!" she exclaimed, her voice sharp with fear. Alaric looked up at her through fever-glazed eyes, a flicker of recognition in their depths. "Ilara," he murmured, his voice hoarse and broken. "Forgive me, did not wish to disturb you." But Ilara was already in command. "Mr. Finch," she called, her voice clear and decisive despite her racing heart. "Send for Dr. Barlow immediately, and have a fire lit in the Marquis's chamber at once, along with fresh linens and water." "Already seen to, my lady," Mr. Finch assured her, his usual stoic demeanor betraying genuine concern. "James has gone for the doctor." "Help me get him upstairs," Ilara instructed, her fear giving way to decisive action. "He needs to be in bed at once." Between the footman and Ilara's support, they managed to get the Marquis to his bedchamber. His valet, Stevens, was already turning down the bed and stoking the fire, his movements efficient. With a nod to Ilara, he began removing Alaric's travel-soiled clothing. "I shall wait outside," Ilara said, moving toward the door to give her husband privacy, her cheeks warming slightly at the intimacy of the scene. "No." Alaric's fevered gaze found hers, unexpectedly lucid for a moment. His voice was a raw whisper, tinged with a desperate plea. "Stay, please." She nodded, her heart quickening at his vulnerability, and turned her back while Stevens completed his task and helped the Marquis into a nightshirt. When he was settled in bed, his breathing shallow and quick, Ilara approached again, taking the chair that Stevens placed beside it. Dr. Barlow arrived within the hour, his lined face grave as he examined the Marquis. Ilara waited anxiously in the adjoining sitting room, pacing before the fire until the doctor emerged, his medical bag clasped in his hand. "Influenza, as I suspect you already guessed," he confirmed, his tone somber. "A severe case, I'm afraid. The next 48 hours will be critical." Ilara's heart raced with fear. She had seen influenza claim lives before, healthy young lives snuffed out in days, and her mind flashed to Clara Ashford, taken so cruelly and swiftly. "What can be done?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her heart. "Keep him cool to combat the fever. Ensure he drinks water, broth if he can manage it. I've left a laudanum for the pain and to help him sleep." The elderly physician hesitated, his kind eyes troubled. "My lady, I must warn you, the servants may be reluctant to attend him closely. There is always fear when sickness of this nature strikes a household." "I understand, Doctor," Ilara said, squaring her shoulders. "Thank you for your candor." After Dr. Barlow departed, Ilara called Mrs. Croft and Mr. Finch to the drawing room. "The Marquis is gravely ill," she informed them, her voice calm despite her inner turmoil. "I will need a rotation of staff to assist in his care." Mrs. Croft and Mr. Finch exchanged uncomfortable glances. "My lady," the housekeeper began, her normally austere face betraying unease. "The staff is concerned about contagion. The last time influenza swept through the house, during the old Marquis's time, 3 servants died." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "I see." She considered for a moment, then made her decision. "Then I shall tend to him myself." "My lady!" Mrs. Croft gasped, scandalized. "That is hardly appropriate. Perhaps we could send for a nurse from the village." "There is no time," Ilara said firmly. "And I will not have it said that the Marquesa of Blackwood abandoned her husband in his hour of need." She looked from one stunned face to the other. "I will require fresh water, clean linens, and broth to be brought at regular intervals. Beyond that, I will manage." "Yes, my lady," Mr. Finch said, a new respect evident in his voice, his gaze unwavering. As night fell, Diana took her place at the Marquis's bedside. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, his powerful frame, so recently commanding, now racked with fever and chills. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words she couldn't understand. Ilara dipped a cloth in cool water and gently bathed his face and neck. His skin burned beneath her fingers, his breathing labored. She had discarded her shawl hours ago, her hair falling loose down her back, as she worked tirelessly to bring his temperature down. "You must fight this, Alaric," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, the sound feeling both foreign and profoundly intimate on her tongue. "You are too stubborn to let a mere fever defeat you." Throughout the long night she tended him without rest, changing the cool compresses, coaxing sips of water between his parched lips, administering the laudanum when pain twisted his features. When his nightshirt became soaked with sweat, she changed it herself, her hands steady, despite the intimacy of the task, her heart a relentless drum of fear and devotion. It was near dawn, during the darkest hour of the night, when the Marquis's fever reached its terrifying peak. He thrashed against the bedclothes, calling out in distress. "Isolde!" he moaned, his voice raw with anguish. "Mother, Don't leave me! Ilara's heart clenched. She took his hand between both of hers, holding tight. Shh! You're not alone, she soothed, stroking his brow. I'm here with you, Alaric. I'm here. His eyes opened, glazed with fever, not truly seeing her. She's gone, he whispered brokenly. He said it was my fault. My fault she died. A fresh wave of pain washed over her, at his deeply ingrained guilt. No, Ilara said firmly, though she knew he was lost in delirium. It was never your fault, Alaric. Never. He gripped her hand with surprising strength, his fevered mind shifting. Clara, he murmured, a name Ilara didn't recognize. I'm sorry. Couldn't save you. Ilara continued to hold his hand as his words dissolved into restless sleep once more, the names echoing in her mind. Isolde. Clara. Another piece of the puzzle that was her husband, two names connected to profound pain and regret, and now to a hidden letter. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, the Marquis's fever finally broke, his breathing easing into a more regular rhythm. Ilara, exhausted beyond measure, laid her head on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand, and fell into an uneasy sleep. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the heavy curtains of Alaric's bedchamber, the relentless grip of the fever finally loosened. His thrashing subsided. His breathing eased into a shallow, more even rhythm. Ilara, exhausted beyond measure from her long night's vigil, laid her head on the edge of the bed, still clutching his hand, and fell into an uneasy sleep. She woke to the sensation of fingers gently stroking her hair, a feather-light touch that drew her from the depths of weariness. Opening her eyes, she found Alaric awake, his gaze clear for the first time in hours, fixed upon her face. You stayed, he said, his voice raspy from the long night's ordeal, though the fever's haze had lifted. Ilara sat up abruptly, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, her hair loose, her blue silk dress wrinkled, dark shadows under her eyes. Of course I stayed. Alaric's eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The servants wouldn't come near, he murmured, his voice regaining a touch of its usual depth. They were afraid, but you weren't. Ilara met his gaze steadily, refusing to shy away from the truth. I was, she admitted quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Not of the fever, but of losing you. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something shifting in his expression, a softening, a recognition that touched her soul. You changed my nightshirt, he said after a moment, a hint of his old reserve returning, yet his eyes held a new warmth. Ilara felt a blush creep up her cheeks. It needed to be done. A ghost of a smile, fleeting yet genuine, touched his lips. You continue to surprise me, Lady Elara Vance. Blackwood, she corrected softly, her heart quickening. Elara Blackwood. For a long moment he simply looked at her, something new and unnamed passing between them. A fragile thread spun in the crucible of fear and care. Then, yes, he said quietly, his voice imbued with a meaning she had not heard before. My wife. It wasn't a declaration of love, not even close. But in those two simple words, spoken without the usual distance, Ilara heard the first chime of a bell that had been silent for too long. As Ilara rose to fetch fresh water, his hand caught hers once more. His fingers were warm and steady now, no longer burning with fever. Thank you, he said. The words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue, spoken with an earnestness that was both vulnerable and profound. Ilara nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Something had changed during that long night of vigil, something fundamental and irrevocable. His gratitude, so raw and unpracticed, felt like a bridge crossing the chasm that had separated them. Ilara slipped from the room, leaving Alaric to rest, her mind a whirlwind. As she moved through the hushed corridors, giving quiet instructions to Mr. Finch for fresh broth and linens, she realized with a start that her marriage was no longer solely an arrangement of convenience. Somewhere in the quiet hours of tending to a man lost in fever dreams, she had begun to care for her husband, perhaps even to love him. The thought, so new and overwhelming, was both thrilling and terrifying, a fragile seed of hope planted in the very heart of Blackwood Crest. Alaric's recovery was slow but steady. For a week, he remained confined to his bed, his usually formidable strength sapped by the fever. During this time, Ilara continued to oversee his care, spending hours reading to him from volumes of Scots poetry, discussing estate matters that he could manage from his bed, or simply sitting in companionable silence as he dozed. These quiet days of convalescence revealed aspects of Alaric Blackwood that Ilara might never have discovered otherwise. His dry wit, his extensive knowledge of literature, his thoughtful opinions on everything from agricultural techniques to political reform. Without the pressures of formal society or the weight of managing the estate, he seemed lighter somehow, more inclined to conversation and even occasional, soft laughter. One afternoon, as they sat before the crackling fire in his sitting room, Ilara reading aloud, Alaric closed the book, marking her place with a ribbon. "You risked your own health," he remarked, his gaze serious. "Why?" Ilara met his eyes, her own unwavering. "Would you have had me abandon you to the care of frightened servants, or a hired nurse who saw you only as a duty?" "Most wives of our circle would have done precisely that," he pointed out, a flicker in his eyes. "It would have been perfectly acceptable." "I am not most wives," Ilara replied simply, her voice firm, "and I did not marry you to be acceptable, but to be your wife in name at least, if nothing more." "And if I wished for more than a wife in name only?" he asked, his voice low, probing. Ilara's heart quickened. "Then you would need to tell me what that means, my lord, for you once made it very clear that I would never be your true wife." Alaric winced slightly at the reminder of his cold declaration. "I was not at my best when we met," he admitted, his gaze falling to his hands. "I had convinced myself that a marriage of convenience was all I required. All I deserved, perhaps." He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers. "And now," he continued, looking back at her, "now I find myself wondering what might be possible between two people who began as strangers, but have perhaps become something more." "I would like to discover that as well," Ilara said, her voice hardly above a whisper. For a moment they simply sat in silence, hands joined, the fire crackling in the grate. Then Alaric spoke again, his face solemn, his eyes shadowed. "There are things you should know about me, Ilara, things I have never shared with anyone." He paused, a deep breath filling his chest. "About my mother's death. About Clara." Ilara squeezed his hand gently. "There will be time for all of that," she assured him softly, "when you are stronger." He nodded, grateful for the reprieve, yet somehow lighter for having expressed the intention. "Will you read a little more?" he asked, his voice a quiet request. "Your voice. It brings me peace." Ilara opened the book again, resuming where she had left off, her heart full of tentative hope. As she read the poet's words of love and longing, she felt Alaric's gaze upon her face, no longer distant or guarded, but warm with something that might in time grow into affection, perhaps even love. The quiet hum of the room, the crackle of the fire, her voice weaving through the verses. It was a moment of unexpected, profound peace. From the hallway outside, Mrs. Croft observed the scene through the partially open door. The Marquis and his bride, hands clasped, faces illuminated by firelight, a tableau of quiet intimacy that reminded the old housekeeper of another couple long ago, of Lady Isolde. A rare smile, almost imperceptible, softened Mrs. Croft's stern features. "Lady Isolde would approve," she murmured to herself as she moved away. Her son has found his way home at last. November arrived with bitter winds and early frosts, but within Blackwood Crest, a different sort of change was taking place. The weeks following the Marquis's illness had brought a gradual but unmistakable shift in his relationship with Ilara. They now took most meals together, spent evenings in the library sharing books and conversation, and walked the grounds arm in arm when weather permitted. Though they still maintained separate bedchambers, a fact that occasionally caused Ilara moments of wistful contemplation, in most other respects they had begun to forge a true partnership. Yet, despite this new closeness, Ilara sensed her husband still held part of himself in reserve. The name he had spoken during his fever, Clara, had not been mentioned again, though it lingered in Ilara's thoughts, a ghost in the corners of her mind. She knew there was another piece of the puzzle that was George Alaric Blackwood, waiting to be revealed, another secret to be unearthed before their bond could be truly complete. "I told you my mother died when I was 12, he began finally, his voice low. "What I didn't explain was that after her death, my father changed. Or perhaps, as you once suggested, he simply revealed his true nature without her moderating influence." He drew a deep breath, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "He became cruel, particularly to me. He blamed me for her death. She fell ill after nursing me through a similar fever, and he made certain I knew it." Lady Seraphina encouraged his bitterness. She had always resented my mother, and now she had her opportunity to erase Lady Isolde's memory from Blackwood. Elara, deeply moved by his raw confession, reached into her pocket. "My lord," she said, her voice gentle, "I believe this belongs to you." She presented the fragile, water-damaged letter she had found in the garden. Alaric took it, his eyes widening at the familiar, elegant handwriting. The visible fragments of his mother's words, troubles, fear for Alaric's future, seemed to echo his own pain. Alaric's voice, when he continued, was hardened with old wounds. "That's why the garden was abandoned. It was the first thing to go. Then her portraits were moved to storage, her rooms redecorated, her name rarely spoken. I was sent away to school shortly after, not Eton where my friends were, but a remote, austere institution in Scotland known for its harsh discipline. My father claimed it would make a man of me." Elara's heart ached at the thought of a grieving boy sent away, shouldering an undeserved burden of guilt. 6 years. He continued, a muscle working in his jaw. "I was permitted home only briefly in summers. And by then, Lady Seraphina was effectively mistress of Blackwood, though my father never actually married her." His voice hardened further. "She had hoped he would, of course. That was always her ambition, to be Marquisa of Blackwood. But my father was too shrewd to grant her the legal status she craved." "And Miss Isolde?" Elara asked gently, recalling the quiet, nervous girl. Alaric's expression softened slightly, a faint wistfulness in his eyes. "Miss Isolde came to Blackwood when she was 10, a quiet, frightened girl. My father treated her with a kindness he never showed me, which Lady Seraphina was quick to interpret as evidence that he might adopt Miss Isolde as his ward, perhaps even make her his heir, if I continued to disappoint him." Elara's eyes widened. Could he have done such a thing? Set aside his own son and heir? "Not legally, no," Alaric conceded. "But he could have made my position extremely difficult had he chosen to. Miss Isolde herself was an innocent in her mother's schemes. We developed something of an understanding over the years, both of us pawns in games played by others." "What happened when you came of age?" Elara asked gently. "I went to university, then traveled abroad for several years. It was easier than returning to Blackwood." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I discovered I had some aptitude for business and investment. By 25, I had built my own modest fortune, independent of my inheritance. I thought perhaps I had finally escaped my father's shadow." His expression darkened again, the fleeting smile vanishing. "Then I met Clara Ashford." Elara's breath caught. Here at last was the mysterious Clara, the name he had called out in his fevered state. She was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, beautiful, intelligent, full of life. For the first time, Alaric's voice wavered slightly, thick with emotion. We met at a musical in London. She played the pianoforte brilliantly and laughed at my poor attempts at humor. Within a month I had asked for her hand, and her father had consented. You were engaged, Elara said softly, understanding beginning to dawn, a pang of sympathy for the vibrant woman he had lost. Alaric nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant, painful memory. For 6 months, the happiest of my life. My father was furious, of course. The daughter of a merchant was hardly the match he had envisioned for the future Marquis of Blackwood. He refused to attend the wedding, threatened to cut me off entirely. But you didn't care, Elara guessed. I would have married her if she hadn't had a penny to her name, he confirmed. We had plans. A house in London, travels to Italy, a life built on our own terms. Elara already knew this story would not end happily, yet her heart contracted at the pain evident in his face. What happened? Influenza. Alaric said simply, the single word laden with grief. 3 weeks before our wedding, I was in Edinburgh on business. By the time I received word and returned to London, she was gone. He closed his eyes briefly. I never even had the chance to say goodbye. Oh, Alaric, Elara whispered, taking his hand in hers. I'm so sorry. He turned his hand to clasp hers, drawing strength from her touch. My father called it divine judgment, punishment for my defiance in choosing a bride he hadn't approved. Lady Serafina suggested it was Clara's common blood that made her too weak to fight the illness. Elara's indignation flared, a hot rush of anger. How dare they? To use such a tragedy to wound you further? It hardly mattered by then, Alaric interrupted, his voice hollow. I was already devastated, beyond their reach. I retreated to my London house, saw no one for months. When my father died suddenly the following year, I returned to Blackwood, only out of duty. He looked around the drawing room, his expression distant. I became Marquis of Blackwood at 28, master of an estate I had grown to hate, with a title that had brought me nothing but pain. I closed off the east wing where my mother's rooms had been, dismissed half the staff who remembered her, and dedicated myself to business matters, rarely spending more than a few weeks here at a time. And Lady Serafina? Elara asked. She expected to remain at Blackwood, of course. One of my first acts as Marquis was to settle a modest income on her and Miss Isolde and establish them in a house in Bath. A hint of grim satisfaction crossed his face. She has never forgiven me for thwarting her ambitions. Elara thought of the woman's barely concealed hostility during her visit and understood it in a new light. And for 8 years you lived thus, alone, dividing your time between London and an estate you could not love. Yes, Alaric acknowledged, his gaze meeting hers directly now. Until my solicitor suggested it was time I married and secured the succession. A business arrangement, he called it. A suitable wife from a good family who would provide heirs and manage the social obligations I had neglected. Elara felt a chill at his words, remembering their first meeting and his cold declaration that she would never be his true wife. I agreed because it seemed the sensible course, the only course. I had convinced myself I was incapable of loving again. And then I arrived, Elara said quietly. Yes. Alaric's expression softened, a warmth in his eyes that had never been there before. You arrived, with your quiet dignity and your unexpected spirit. You who faced Lady Serafina without flinching. You who brought my mother's garden back to life. His voice dropped lower, filled with a raw emotion that made Elara's heart quicken. You who stayed when everyone else fled from my sickness. I couldn't leave you, Elara said simply. I know that now. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. And that is why I needed to tell you about Clara, he explained, his gaze earnest. Because her memory has stood between us from the beginning, my guilt at failing her. My fear of experiencing such loss again. You haven't failed her, Elara said firmly. Illness claimed her just as it nearly claimed you. Neither was your fault. Perhaps, Alaric conceded, a long-held burden easing from his shoulders. But for years I've held myself responsible for not being there when she needed me, for not protecting her as I had promised. And now, Elara asked, her voice hardly more than a whisper, now I find myself facing a different sort of guilt. He reached up to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. The guilt of realizing I have begun to care deeply for a woman who is, in fact, my wife, when I had vowed never to open my heart again. Elara leaned slightly into his touch, her pulse racing. That is not something worthy of guilt, Alaric, isn't it? His eyes searched hers. I told you that you would never be my true wife. I entered our marriage determined to keep you at arm's length. I denied us both the chance for happiness out of fear and old wounds. The past cannot be undone, Elara said gently. But the future is ours to shape together, if you wish it. For answer, Alaric drew her closer, one hand cradling her face. I do wish it, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. More than I believed possible. When his lips met hers, Elara felt as though some final barrier between them had dissolved. This was not the perfunctory kiss of their wedding ceremony, but a true meeting of hearts, tender, reverent, and filled with promise. There is something else I've been meaning to show you, Lord Alaric said, his expression lighter than Elara had ever seen it, yet still tinged with a delicate uncertainty. He held her hand, a warmth spreading through her veins that banished the lingering chill of the rainy afternoon. Will you come with me? Curious and slightly apprehensive, Elara allowed him to lead her from the drawing room. Their footsteps echoed softly as they ascended the grand staircase, a familiar journey, but one that took an unfamiliar turn. Instead of heading towards her own East Wing apartments, or his study, Alaric guided her down a corridor she had never explored. It was older, perhaps, the wallpaper a deeper, faded shade, the air a little stiller. They stopped before a set of double doors, heavy and carved with intricate, forgotten designs. Alaric produced a small, ornate key from his waistcoat pocket, his fingers lingering on the cold metal for a moment. These were my mother's private rooms, he explained, his voice a low murmur, rich with memory. I closed them after inheriting the title. No one has entered in 8 years. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief and the passage of time. With a soft click, the lock yielded, and Alaric pushed open the doors. Lara stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, the faint scent of dust and dried potpourri hanging in the air. Alaric moved to the tall windows, drawing back the heavy velvet curtains with a purposeful sweep, allowing the weak afternoon light to filter into a spacious sitting room. Dust cloths covered the furniture like silent ghosts, and the air held the stillness of long disuse. Yet, despite the neglect, there was something undeniably welcoming about the space, an elegant grace that spoke of a life once lived with beauty and passion. It felt like a sacred place, a memory preserved. Elara's heart ached with a tender understanding. It's beautiful, Elara whispered, her gaze sweeping across the elegant proportions of the room, the delicate moldings on the ceiling, the tall windows that overlooked what had once been Lady Isolde's vibrant rose garden, now slowly returning to life under Elara's care. There was a subtle femininity to the decor, a softness that contrasted sharply with the more imposing grandeur of the rest of Blackwood Crest. This was a space built for comfort, for quiet contemplation, for a woman's touch. Alaric, watching her face intently, moved closer. These should have been your rooms from the beginning, he said, his voice quiet but firm. As Marquesa, they are rightfully yours. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone occupying them after her, but now. He hesitated, then met her gaze, a raw honesty shining in his blue eyes. Now I think my mother would want you to make them your own. Elara felt a profound sense of emotion swell within her. The gesture was more than an offering of rooms. It was a profound act of trust, a symbolic bridge between his past and their future. Are you certain? She asked, her voice barely audible, deeply moved. She knew the pain those rooms must hold for him, the memories locked away for so long. He nodded, taking both her hands in his grip warm and steady. Completely. Elara, I have spent too many years allowing grief to dictate my life, to keep me imprisoned by shadows. It's time to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. Just as my mother's garden is blooming again under your care, perhaps Blackwood itself can become a true home once more. His words were a promise, not just for the house, but for them. "I would like that," Elara said softly, her eyes welling with unexpected tears. "Very much." There was a moment of comfortable silence, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the window panes, a softer rhythm now than the earlier downpour. Alaric still held her hands, his thumb tracing a slow, tender circle on her skin. Elara's heart thrummed with a nervous anticipation, a sense that another momentous question hung in the air between them. He seemed to gather his thoughts, his gaze dropping to their joined hands before he looked up at her again, his blue eyes searching. "There's something else," George added, his manner suddenly less certain, a vulnerability in his posture that Elara found profoundly endearing. "Something I've been considering since my recovery." Elara prompted gently when he hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. "Yes?" "Our current arrangement," he began, his voice a little strained. "Separate rooms, separate lives in many ways. It was what I wanted when we married. What I believed I needed." He shook his head, a flicker of self-frustration crossing his handsome features. "I thought it practical. I thought it safe." He drew a deep breath, as though bracing himself for a great leap. "It is not what I want now." Elara's heart began to race, a joyful, terrifying beat. She knew, instinctively, what he was struggling to say. "Elara," he finally managed, his voice dropping to a near whisper laden with earnest hope, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife in truth, not merely in name?" The question hung in the air, momentous, and yet so simple, so utterly profound. Elara looked at the man before her, no longer the cold, distant Marquis who had once declared she would never be his true wife, but a man who had shown her his wounded heart, his hidden depths, and was now offering it, completely, into her keeping. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion welling within her. "I would be honored to be your true wife, Alaric." The smile that transformed Alaric's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds, chasing away the last vestiges of shadow that had clung to him for so long. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, filling them with a warmth that made Elara's own heart ache with joy. He drew her closer, one hand cradling her face, the other wrapping around her waist, pulling her gently against him. His touch was reverent, as though she were infinitely precious, and Elara leaned into his embrace, feeling a sense of belonging she had never known. "I cannot promise you a perfect happiness," he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I have been too long in darkness to find the light easily. There are still shadows, still lessons to learn." Elara raised her head slightly to meet his gaze, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I don't ask for perfection, Alaric," she replied, echoing words she had spoken to him during his illness, words that had come to define the honest foundation of their burgeoning love. "Only for honesty, and the chance to build something real between us." For answer, his lips met hers again, no longer a hesitant, formal brush, but a kiss deeper now, filled with newfound hope and possibilities neither had dared imagine when they had first met in his study all those months ago. It was a kiss of commitment, of shared vulnerabilities, of a future unfolding. It sealed their promise, a silent vow that transcended words, a melding of two souls that had found each other against all odds. As they drew apart, breathless, the air around them seemed to shimmer with the promise of a love finally given room to breathe, to grow. Outside the manor, as if in response to the resolution within, the rain had stopped. Weak, diffused sunlight broke through the heavy, gray clouds, casting a tentative golden glow over the land. The world seemed to sigh, exhaling the last remnants of the storm. The formal garden, still damp and glistening, began to sparkle, each droplet on a leaf catching the light like a tiny jewel. Most notably, Lady Isolde's newly restored rose garden, now freed from its wild tangle and blossoming with diligent care, seemed to stretch towards the light, its delicate petals unfurling in quiet celebration. The journey that had brought Elara and Alaric to this moment, from a cold transactional agreement in that very study to a profound, heart-deep connection, felt like a story unfolding in tandem with the landscape around them. The shadows of their pasts, the long years of grief and isolation, the societal pressures and external threats, had all served to forge a bond stronger than either had imagined possible. Their love, once a fragile seedling planted in barren ground, had weathered the storms and found its roots, ready now to blossom fully in the light. It was a testament not only to their individual resilience, but to the transformative power of choosing vulnerability, of daring to open one's heart again after believing it irrevocably broken. The air itself felt different, lighter, imbued with the promise of new beginnings. In the months that followed, Blackwood Crest underwent a transformation as remarkable as that of its master and mistress. Ilara, with a respectful blend of her own discerning taste and a deep reverence for Lady Isolde's memory, moved into the private rooms in the east wing. The dust sheets were removed, the furniture polished, and the faded grandeur revived with fresh textiles and carefully chosen accents. She preserved the delicate moldings and the view of the rose garden, adding her own touches of warmth and vibrant color, turning a somber museum into a living, breathing space. The east wing, long closed off and silent, became once again a center of life and activity. Footmen and maids bustled through its corridors, fires crackled in the grates, and the soft murmur of Ilara's voice could often be heard through the open doors. Alaric, too, found himself drawn to these rooms, spending more and more time there, reading quietly by the fire as Ilara worked, or simply observing her with a gentle, appreciative gaze. Through Ilara's eyes, he began to rediscover his childhood home, where he had only remembered pain. He now saw beauty in the intricate carvings, the ancient tapestries, the sun-drenched conservatories. He found comfort in the quiet traditions she embraced, and a sense of belonging that had been absent for far too long. Blackwood Crest was no longer a mausoleum of grief and duty. It was, at last, becoming a true home, filled with warmth, purpose, and the gentle hum of shared life. Alaric's own expression, once so habitually guarded, softened visibly, a subtle but profound change reflected in the welcoming atmosphere of the house. Their partnership, once forged in the crucible of personal revelation and external threat, extended far beyond the walls of the manor, embracing the wider community of Blackwood. Together, Ilara and Alaric began to visit the tenant farms, not as distant landlords, but as engaged stewards. Ilara, with her innate practicality and compassionate eye, would inquire about crop yields, livestock health, and the well-being of the families. She would note cottages that needed repair, suggesting improvements that would truly make a difference in their tenants' lives. Alaric, in turn, with his keen business acumen and newly awakened sense of responsibility, implemented these suggestions with efficiency and fairness. They established a small school for the estate children, ensuring that every child had the opportunity for an education, a luxury many had never dreamed of. Ilara spent hours there, reading to the children, encouraging their curiosity, and ensuring the schoolmistress had all she needed. Their joint efforts created a tangible sense of progress and prosperity. The tenant farmers, once accustomed to the aloofness of the previous Marquis, now greeted them with genuine smiles and heartfelt gratitude. The improvements benefited everyone who called Blackwood home, fostering a sense of community and loyalty that had long been absent. Ilara's compassionate nature complemented Alaric's methodical approach, creating a formidable and benevolent force for good, slowly but surely weaving a rich tapestry of connection and care across their entire domain. As winter settled over the countryside, blanketing the newly restored rose garden in a pristine white silence, Ilara and Alaric established new traditions of their own, weaving them seamlessly into the ancient fabric of Blackwood Crest. Evenings, once spent in separate, silent pursuits, now found them together in the library, ensconced by the crackling fire. They would read to each other from favorite books, Alaric's deep voice rumbling through Scott's historical epics, Ilara's softer tones bringing to life the lyrical verses of Tennyson. These quiet hours of shared literature became a cherished ritual, deepening their intellectual and emotional intimacy. Sunday visits to the village church, a duty Alaric had neglected since inheriting the title, became a shared pilgrimage, a symbol of their commitment to their community and to each other. During the festive season, Blackwood Crest, once a place of somber restraint, burst into life. Christmas decorations, more lavish than the manor had seen in a decade, adorned every hall and chamber, culminating in a grand feast for the tenants in the great hall, a joyous affair filled with music and laughter. And at night, In the sacred privacy of what was now their shared bedchamber in the East Wing, they rediscovered each other anew. No longer strangers united by duty and convenience, but partners who had chosen each other freely, with full knowledge of the other's strengths and frailties. Their intimacy deepened, becoming a tender exploration of hearts and bodies, bound by a love that was both passionate and profound. The warmth they generated together filled the once cold manor, making it truly a home. It was in such a moment, as they lay entwined in the soft darkness of their bedchamber, the gentle crackle of the fire, a soothing backdrop, that Elara finally found the courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind since learning of Clara Ashford. Her head rested on Alaric's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and she whispered, "Do you still think of her?" "Of Clara?" He didn't pretend to misunderstand, his fingers gently stroking her hair in a familiar, comforting gesture. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice soft and thoughtful, devoid of any lingering pain, but rich with reflection. Not with the sharp grief of before, Elara. That has long since faded, replaced by something quieter. A kind of gratitude, perhaps. She taught me I was capable of love, at a time when I had begun to doubt it. She showed me what my heart was capable of. Elara smiled faintly in the darkness, a genuine, understanding smile. There was no jealousy, only a profound empathy for the young man Alaric had been, and a deep appreciation for the journey that had led him to her. "I wish I could have known her," she said sincerely. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." Her words were honest, a testament to the secure foundation of their own love. "She would have liked you, Elara," Alaric said, his voice imbued with a quiet certainty. He shifted, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. "But it is you, Elara Blackwood, who has brought me back to life. You who has made Blackwood a home again. You who has taught me that even a heart long closed can learn to beat anew." His words, heartfelt and profound, resonated deep within her, a beautiful affirmation of their journey. Elara smiled, her own heart swelling with love and pride. "We have done it together," she corrected gently, raising her head to look into his eyes, which, even in the dim light, shone with an unmistakable affection. "Yes," he agreed, drawing her closer, his arms tightening around her as if to hold her forever. "We have, and we have a lifetime ahead to continue the work. To fill this house with more than just our presence, but with joy, with purpose, with life." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant, mournful howl of the winter wind outside. But inside there was only warmth, only connection, a profound sense of peace. Elara was nearly asleep, nestled safely in his embrace, when Alaric spoke again, his voice thoughtful, as if he were musing aloud to himself. "I had convinced myself that love was a weakness," Alaric mused, his voice carrying a new wisdom, a depth that had been absent in the cold, distant Marquis Elara had first met. His fingers gently stroked her arm, a soothing, rhythmic touch. "That it made one vulnerable to unbearable loss. I saw my mother's death, Clara's death, and believed that to love deeply was to invite inevitable, devastating pain." His arms tightened around her protectively, a gesture that now spoke of strength, not fear. He paused, a profound realization etched in his tone as he continued. "I was wrong, utterly, terribly wrong. Love is not a weakness, Elara. It is the greatest strength we possess. It takes more courage to open one's heart, to risk that vulnerability, than to keep it locked away behind walls of fear and solitude." He lifted her chin, his eyes searching hers in the soft moonlight, and Elara saw not only love, but a deep, hard-won understanding reflected there. It was a truth he had learned through immense suffering, and a truth he now fully embraced. Elara felt a surge of admiration for the man he had become, for the courage he had shown in dismantling his own fortress. Elara raised herself on one elbow, looking down at her husband's face, silvered in the moonlight streaming through a gap in the curtains. A playful smile touched her lips, easing the profound weight of his confession. "When did you become so wise, my lord?" she asked, only half teasing, her fingers tracing the strong line of his brow. Alaric smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes and crinkled their corners. He reached up to cup her cheek, his touch tender. "When I had the good sense to marry a woman wiser than myself," he replied, his voice laced with affectionate humor, though I was too stubborn to recognize it at first. Elara laughed softly, a sound of pure contentment, settling back into his embrace. "We have both learned much since that first meeting in your study, haven't we?" "Indeed," Alaric agreed, his voice growing serious once more, yet filled with an undeniable tenderness. "Though there is one thing I knew even then, despite my best efforts to deny it, despite all the walls I had built around my heart." "And what was that?" Elara whispered, her heart quickening with anticipation. "That you were extraordinary, Elara Vance," he said, his gaze fixed on hers, unwavering and full of adoration. He kissed her then, with a tender reverence that spoke volumes. "And that I was fortunate beyond measure that you had agreed to become Elara Blackwood." Outside, snow continued to fall, mantling Blackwood Crest in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, the Marquis and Marquesa of Blackwood drifted to sleep, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had become something far more rare and precious. A true meeting of hearts, bound by a love that had overcome pride, pain, and the shadows of the past to find its way into the light. A few weeks after his recovery, Lord Alaric Blackwood, now fully restored to his formidable strength, summoned Sir Reginald Craven to his study. Elara stood by Alaric's side, her posture firm, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent, united front. Sir Reginald, a portly man with shifting, avaricious eyes, fidgeted before them. He began with bluster, repeating his demands, his threats of exposing Elara's father's affairs to the Khan. Alaric listened, impassive, until Craven paused for breath. Then, the Marquis began to speak, his voice calm but sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He dissected Craven's claims, revealing intricate legal loopholes in the old Vance debts, citing obscure statutes that rendered Craven's demands null. More chillingly, Alaric then presented evidence of Craven's own past illegal dealings, acquired by his London solicitors during his recovery. Craven's face blanched, his bluster evaporating into a stammering retreat. He was dismissed, utterly defeated. The threat from Elara's past, now nothing more than a ghost, laid to rest. After Sir Reginald Craven's humiliated departure, a profound silence settled in the study. Alaric turned to Elara, a hint of pride softening the lines around his eyes. She met his gaze, her own filled with immense relief and a deep, burgeoning gratitude. "Thank you, Alaric," she said, her voice quiet, heartfelt. "You handled him with such precision." A small smile touched his lips. "It was a matter of principle, and protecting what is mine." His words, once chilling, now resonated with a warmth that settled deep within her. She acknowledged his protection, a bond forged not just in shared vulnerability, but in their united strength against the world. 5 years later, the once somber grounds of Blackwood Crest bloomed with life and joy. The restored rose garden, vibrant with white and crimson blossoms, echoed with the sound of children's laughter. 4-year-old Lady Isolde Clara Blackwood, whom they affectionately called Ellie, a determined sprite with her father's dark hair and her mother's spirited eyes, led her younger brother, 2-year-old James, on a merry chase among the fragrant bushes. From the terrace, Elara watched them, a soft smile on her lips, one hand resting unconsciously on her rounded belly where their third child grew. The doctors had assured her this pregnancy would be as healthy as her previous two, but Alaric still insisted she rest frequently, a tenderness that still surprised and warmed her. As if summoned by her thoughts, Alaric appeared at her side, placing a protective arm around her waist. "Careful, Ellie," Elara called, her voice gentle. "Your brother cannot run as quickly as you." The little girl slowed, obligingly turning to take her toddling brother's hand with surprising gentleness. "Come on, Jamie," she said, her voice clear and decisive. "I'll show you the frog pond." Alaric chuckled, a sound that had become wonderfully familiar over the years. "Our daughter has her mother's kind heart," he observed, watching the children. "And her father's leadership abilities," Elara added, with a smile. "No one refuses Ellie anything when she sets her mind to it." Alaric's chuckle deepened. "Heaven help us when she comes of age. The ton won't know what hit them." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children explore the world they had created together. A world built on trust, respect, and deep, abiding love. "Do you ever think about that day when we first met?" Elara asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "How different things might have been if we had continued as we began." Alaric pressed a kiss to her temple, his lips warm. "I try not to dwell on what might have been, my love, but I thank Providence every day that you were brave enough to see beyond my walls, stubborn enough to remain when I pushed you away, and loving enough to show me what it meant to truly live again." Elara turned in his arms to face him, her eyes shining. "It wasn't bravery, Alaric," she said softly. "It was love, perhaps even before I recognized it myself." Alaric's eyes, once so cold, now held a warmth that encompassed her entirely. "Then I am the most fortunate of men," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to have been loved so well." The afternoon sun, mellow and golden, cast long shadows across the lawns. In his gaze, Elara saw the reflection of her own heart, complete, cherished, and utterly at home. "Come," Alaric said, offering his arm, "let's join our children. James has been asking all morning to show you his collection of interesting stones." Elara took his arm, her hand fitting perfectly into the crook of his elbow, and smiled up at the man she had come to know and love so deeply. "Lead the way, my love," she said. "Lead the way." And together the Marquis and Marquesa of Blackwood Crest walked hand in hand into the sunshine, toward the future they had built with patience, courage, and the transformative power of a love that had defied all expectations.